Tim, you wrote a nice article online. It's on our website at the Alexander Group regarding renewals. And you went into a fair amount of depth that it's a more complex sort of topic than a lot of people give it maybe at first blush. So maybe just to start out, I want to thank you for writing it. It was great, having you share it with us and allowing us to put it on the website. But what inspired you, first of all, to start looking into renewals so deeply, and then in turn actually even write the blog that you put out?
Sure, yeah. So thanks for inviting me along today, Ted. Churn and renewals is definitely a topic that's very close to my heart. You can definitely sense I like to get into a lot of the details. And kind of the genesis for this was really when I joined ForgeRock, we were looking really at this transition to more of a customer success ARR-driven model. And we recognized pretty quickly that in a recurring revenue, an annual recurring revenue world, there's really only two ways that you can grow as a company. You can either grow your incremental net new ARR, or you can reduce your churn. And those are really only the two levers that you've got. So as you're looking at kind of SaaS companies and subscription companies and looking at this kind of ARR measure and growth in ARR is really the number one kind of valuation metric, if you like, that drives whether or not the company is being successful. Churn becomes an increasingly important part of that. And what's interesting about churn is there's lots of different ways of kind of defining churn, measuring churn, managing churn, predicting churn. So we put a lot of effort in at ForgeRock to really understanding the right way to think about churn. Because that's one of the surprising things about ARR and churn. There isn't sort of a generally accepted accounting principle yet defined that articulates how to look at churn and how to define that consistently. If you go out there and speak to 5 different people, you might get 5 different answers in terms of how to calculate it. So we put in place a process to try and understand what is the right way to measure it. And the article is really a summary of some of those key observations.
Yeah, so I mean, look, at first blush, somebody is paying you $100,000 a year, and next year they pay you $90,000 a year, you churn $10,000. Seems pretty simple to me.
That's right.
What am I missing?
Yeah, no, great question. And you're right. At face value, it's a really simple concept. I like to use the analogy of a bucket, a kind of a leaking bucket, if you like, that has a hole in the bottom. You're filling water in the top and you're losing water out the bottom. And what you're trying to do is to stop as much water flowing out the bottom and fill in as much in the top, and that grows the overall size of your business. So in basic terms, it's really pretty straightforward. The challenge becomes when you start to jump into the details around some of the what might be called corner cases. So I can give a couple of examples of those. One of my favorite is this idea of like multi-year contracts. So you have this book of recurring revenue. Let's say you have $100,000 that's coming in from last year. And let's say a customer has already signed up to a 2 or 3 year contract. When you're looking at churn, you could include that as part of your renewal, your base of business that you're looking at in the second year and say, okay, whatever churn we have is a percentage of this number that includes that multi-year revenue. Or you could ignore that and say, we're just going to focus on what's available to renew. So if, let's say, of that $100,000 renewal, let's say $50,000 of that the customer's already contractually committed to. The reality is next year, you've only got $50,000 that's really available to renew because the other $50,000 the customer's already committed to. So, if you take an arbitrary churn number, let's say $5,000 of churn, $5,000 of churn against the $100,000 that includes that multi-year component is 5%. Sounds pretty good. But $5,000 of the $50,000 that's only available to renew is 10%. So pretty big difference in churn rates. And what we try and look at is really focus on that available to renew number. It's useful to communicate and track both, but to really understand the underlying business performance, it's helpful and healthy to focus on that available to renew piece, because that's the piece that's truly churnable, if you like, or up for renewal.
So, Tim, it's interesting, this concept of available to renew. I think what you're saying is there are things that are often called a renewal which really aren't a renewal. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. And that there's also different ways of thinking about churn, which is the sort of the flip side of renewal. So you can talk about churn at a customer level. So did we lose the customer? Kind of logo churn, which is a useful indicator. You can talk about churn at a product level. Did they stop buying a particular product? Did they reduce their entitlement in one particular product line? What we try and focus on is thinking about churn at an overall account level. So from an ARR perspective, did we grow that account year over year? So if the customer's maybe changing the mix of what they've purchased, or maybe even they're buying through a different channel provider or channel partner, as long as we're keeping that customer through that relationship, maybe they're stopping buying product A, but they're starting to buy product B, we try and focus churn at account level, because really what we want to do is we want to focus our sales teams on growing the ARR and account level. So just by talking about churn, let's say at a product level, you start to miss that visibility of the true churn, which is really an account level for us.
Right. So it's interesting because you're now bringing in the account rep, the people who are responsible for growing these accounts, and
yes.
I imagine you and I have chatted about this, that that where this really affects things is when you start talking about compensation. Some companies don't like to pay their account reps for getting a renewal. Some people do. There's different ways of doing it. How are you seeing this conversation impact the compensation plans, and how should people who are listening to this think about that?
Yeah, great question. And we've talked a lot about compensation in the past. It's a big driver of behavior, and you need to make sure that your incentives are aligned to the outcomes and the behaviors to drive those outcomes that you want to set up. So when we think about churn, you're right. From an account level perspective, we want to pay our field sales teams to grow that account. They get paid typically a much higher commission rate, and that needs to be associated from a cost of sales perspective and making sure we're efficient. That should be targeted towards growing those accounts. So you have lots of situations, not lots of situations, but you often have situations whereby a customer may be stopping one project in one part of their business but starting another project somewhere else. And so from a churn perspective, you don't want to compensate the field sales team just to bring you back up to the same level, at least not at the same amount as you want to pay on the incremental new, because you want to incentivize the sales teams to really get that incremental net new ARR. The challenge of that is, of course, then it introduces, or it can introduce sometimes, a bit of conflict in the system, because if I'm a field account rep and I know that there's a big churn on a particular account, I know that in order to get back up to that level, I have to go sell a whole lot more before I start getting paid, at my full rate. So there's some things you can do. You can put in place some spiff programs. You can try and understand more, like in advance, where this might be an issue and kind of deal with it on a case-by-case basis. But I think general best practice for me is to keep the incentives around the field sales teams on incremental new ARR. That's what we care about. Back to the first conversation, why this is important. You've got to grow ending ARR. Only two levers: net incremental ARR and reducing churn. So by keeping the focus on that net incremental ARR, you introduce like more of a healthy approach that I think you can start to deal with on a sort of an exceptions basis. If there are instances where you still want a rep to come in and effectively resell to avoid that churn, and you can put some compensation around that, but that tends to be more of a one-off approach as opposed to like paying everyone on that at the full rate. Yeah.
And so that's the AE, but then you have these other roles that usually are responsible for the renewal. That could be a renewal rep, that could be a customer success rep. There are different people we often see who have that in their pay plan. What's the impact of thinking about different, available to renew?
Yes. Yeah, another great question. So as we think about available to renew and churn, there's probably a couple of different groups that I think are most impacted. Obviously, first of all, the renewals team, but we should also then talk about sales management, because I have quite a strong theory as to kind of how we need to make it fair for the sales managers as well. But on the renewal side, what we try and do is try and get a good forward visibility of where we're seeing churn risk. So based on this churn definition, we'll come up with what we think is our churn risk for the year, and then we'll have our churn goal for the year. And so what we try and do is we take that churn goal and we allocate it based on churn risk. So there may be some customers who are coming up for renew next year who they've already told us they want to churn, they don't want to stay with us. We're going to try and work hard to persuade them otherwise, but the churn risk is pretty high. There might be some other customers where maybe there's a bit of a risk of a reduction, or maybe there's customers we know are very happy. So rather than peanut butter spreading the churn goal across all of those accounts, we try and divvy it up based on where we think the risk is. And then we build the quotas based on that churn allowance. So we actually take a churn, we take what's available to renew, so ignoring all the multi-year stuff, truly what's available to renew, because that's what the renewals team are focused on closing, and then taking off a churn allowance against that that's based on that risk assessment. And we found that to be a really useful way of getting the right balance between focusing on renewal and focusing on churn, rather than just giving the renewal team just a churn number. there's so much work that, as you know, has to go into process renewals, to negotiate contracts, to work with procurement. You have to keep the balance right where you want them to be focused on a bigger renewal number, at the same time have a component of whether it's a bonus or some kind of other lever that's around churn, particularly at a manager level.
Yeah, so I mean, to summarize, I think there's two things I really heard out of that. One is don't just peanut butter the renewal rep across a bunch of different reps. Different territories will have different possibilities. So that's just good old-fashioned quota allocation and doing it with what's actually potential. The other thing is to exclude things that might not be available to renew from the equation. So you're dealing with a real renewal to the company versus something that might show up if you just looked at a SKU level, might look like something that could renew, but it's actually not, like somebody moving to a new contract or a new product or something of that nature.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's right. You want to get that aligned, and then from a manager's perspective, you think about the sales managers. What we're looking at is trying to get the right balance, because if you're a sales manager, other companies, you might have a component of your compensation on renewal. As a sales manager looking after field reps, you'd have, think about new ARR, you might have a component that's related to renewal. What I'm keen at exploring is also introducing more of a focus on churn, because churn is a smaller number. So it's a smaller dollar amount will have a bigger impact on churn. And what you want to try and balance for is to try and equalize effectively the opportunity for the sales manager. What you really want is them focused on like net or ending ARR, because then it's neutral. You won't get into so many discussions or debates about is this new ARR or is this renewal, because ultimately it's all going to be worth the same amount, because what you care about is growing ending ARR. So that's some of the things that we're thinking about, is how can we kind of organize ourselves so that we're all focused on this same goal, which is growing our kind of net ARR number quarter over quarter and year over year.
It's interesting, Ted, Tim, as you know, a study that we're currently getting ready to release right now. We do studies every year on X as a service businesses. A core metric that everybody is looking at is net recurring revenue, which basically looks at the net of what you sold into an account last year and what you're selling into it this year, and seeing how that grows. And there's what's been interesting is the numbers, as more and more companies are becoming as a service and going to land and expand, those numbers have been going up every year. So without giving away too much, it's over 100%, which is good. That means you're growing.
Yes.
But it's both looking at the focus of new and net new, plus the different types of churn. I know we're almost out of time here, Tim. I guess you've done a lot thinking about this. You've talked to us. You've talked to others in the industry. You put together this paper. What was if you had one takeaway from this that you could offer the group listening here? What would that be?
Yeah, good question. I think I would probably say perseverance helps when you're thinking about churn. There's always the next corner case to come across. And that's why, the white paper is really just the starting point for it. But I think for me, it's been the realization that literally you've only got these two levers that you can play on to grow the business. And actually, anything you lose in churn, you have to make up for in net incremental new ARR. So they're equivalent in terms of dollar value. And actually, the churn is probably cheaper for you to retain than it is to go find that extra value in new ARR. So actually, in many ways, churn is sometimes a bit of an afterthought. We think about new ARR, then we think about renewals, and then we try and calculate churn. But I think you said it right. When I'm looking at the performance of a team, performance of a company, it's really net retention, which has churn as a core component. That's just truly the most important health indicator of a business. So the benefit is really, once you've got your arms around that, you can use it to start to predict where you think your risk is going to come, and then you can start to put your resources against the drivers of churn, because the objective is not just to understand and measure how we're doing from a churn perspective. The objective is to get in front of it and understand what are the drivers of that churn, so that we can position our resources 3, 6, 9, 12 months as early as possible in the cycle to try and reduce it. And that's really where we are as a company right now.
Yeah. Well, I feel like we just scratched the surface, but I think this was an important topic. Again, I want to thank you again for writing the article. I encourage anybody listening to this to go read it. And then, if you have any comments or questions, you can respond back on our website, or and then we'll make sure, if possible, we can either respond or get it to Tim. But we're looking for a community of people who are interested in this topic. And again, I want to thank you so much, Tim, for your time today, and look forward to working with you on these things in the future.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Maybe I'll just finish with one last thought, which is, I think we're going to have to come up with a definition of this industry-wide. I kind of joked earlier that we don't have a gap principle for churn, because ARR and net retention really are the health indicators of a SaaS business. I think we're going to have to come up with a way of describing this and defining this at an industry level. So, any and all feedback is welcome. Always looking to improve.
Sounds great. Well, thanks again for your time, and we'll talk soon.